Okay, I should just wait just another couple of minutes to let people come in and before we get started. Okay, Dan, I think we can go now. Thank you.
Everyone ready yet?
Yeah, please.
Okay, welcome everybody from around the world who's listening in on this for the action planning for the global nighttime recovery. I'd like to say this is the first time that the Institute has been involved in this sort of international collaboration between so many experts, and it's good to come together to share best practice to make sure that industries that we really cherish and are really at the heart of communities flourish in the months and years that are ahead of us. So the Institute of Licensing is in partnership here with VibeLab, and we're going to present the insights of the 7 chapters of a global nighttime recovery plan. The plan is a collaborative, practical guide for cities that are trying to determine the best way to design and execute the safe and feasible strategy to reopen and reactivate the creative and nighttime industries and economies. This guide is a joint effort that involves over 130 practitioners, academics, public health experts, and it's aimed to obviously help people move forward and to share best practice. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Lutz from VibeLab, who's going to help chair the session. So thank you very much for taking the time to do this. And for the next couple of hours, we're going to be talking and listening to opinion from a variety of different speakers that cover over 70 cities around the world. So over to Lutz. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Sue. I'm really happy to have this conversation because to have a conversation with people from the cities, from the municipalities who are now also working into resilience, into recovery, is exactly what we wanted to do with this report. And yeah, maybe so you can go into the next slide already. So my name is Lutz Leixenring. I'm a co-founder of VibeLab. VibeLab is a purpose-driven consultancy that is doing research and advocacy in nighttime. My business partner, Mirik Milan, he's based in Amsterdam, the former mayor of the night of Amsterdam. I'm since 12 years a spokesperson of the Club Commission in Berlin. So we are both advocates for what we're doing. And during the pandemic, the initial thought was, let's set up a WhatsApp group for everyone who is working with us in the recent years, and to see if there's not something that we can exchange and think about together in this crisis. And it was already in April, May 2020, so in a very early stage of the pandemic. And on next slide, you see a bit what we did in these months. So we after having this WhatsApp group, we thought maybe we have to, this is a lot of information coming in from all parts of the world. Maybe we have to provide a bit more details and set up a blog on nighttime.org to organize the night and to share the knowledge and to share the people that are behind the nighttime advocacy all over the world. And we also started to do several online workshop meetings. We even also did a hackathon about saving the night. And one of the projects that we also initiated was United We Stream, which was also great success in the UK. And we collected more than 2 million euros in donations, and I think also gave some hope to a lot of people who were in this lockdown phase, very much in a shock moment. So on the next slide, you can see that the work that we've done with a lot of people that are already in this, also joining in as speakers, we did research in the night and in creative industries. So, for instance, we did with Andrena as a Harvard PhD a study about nighttime governance. We published three reports about to measure the creative space of cities. We measured in Berlin, New York, and Tokyo, and at the moment also assessing the creative spaces in Stockholm with our study Creative Footprint. And then we also launched together with the German organization GIZ a research on the impact of COVID-19 on creative industries in the Middle East and in sub-Saharan Africa, which is also, I think, very interesting to read. You can download for free on nighttime.org, and it's I think it's giving also a lot of insights about the creative industries that are struggling, especially the fashion design and music industries in Europe. So going back to the Global Nighttime Recovery Plan on the next slide. So we have great speakers today on this call. Some of them are in the US and join a bit later, and they also will introduce themselves in a few minutes. So I'm not gonna do that already. But I also wanted to shine a light on all the contributors that have been involved in this project. Dan, you mentioned it, it's quite a lot. On the next slide, you will see some of them who are contributors, but we had much more that we interviewed or been involved in a different way. We also shared after every chapter that we published, we shared it in a online webinar and discussed it with audiences from all over the world. And this is how we did it. On the next slide. So the Global Nighttime Recovery Plan, we published already 6 chapters. One more is coming in the next few weeks. We looked into 3 directions to resolve about resilience and return, and to reimaginate and reform the night. Because we also see that a lot of the night was already vulnerable before the COVID pandemic, but throughout the pandemic, it even hits it more, and only a few countries really looked at it closely and developed strategies to help and provide also budgets, of course. And we could also see that the cities that have an advocacy role, like a night mayor or a commission, they were much more resilient. They were already in place. They could have this dialogue with different stakeholders. They were able to survey their scene to really see and find out how they're doing, how is the how long can they actually survive, what is the financial situation, and what is needed. And this communication, to do this communication, those cities who had already an advocacy role in place were definitely much more in a better place. On the next slide, we kind of demonstrated how this whole process of the global nighttime recovery worked. So in the beginning, as I already said, through a WhatsApp group, through our blog, we gathered a lot of information from all over the world. We filtered it throughout our partners at Harvard, at University of Pennsylvania, and Fraunhofer Institute, and developed and organized them in 7 different chapters. Then we shared this chapter. We published it, offered meet the authors calls and discussed those learnings, and then encouraged the people that joined those calls and read the chapters that they discuss it and present it in their own municipalities and in their own communities. On the next slide, you see the different topics that we chose. So these are also the 7 different topics that we're going to present you today. So starting from open air So what is happening outdoors? How can we manage the sound, the noise, the regulations outdoors during the pandemic, but also post-pandemic? How can we actually use public space, open air space for nighttime culture better? Then we looked into the inside of venues. So what are the future of dance floors? That led us to a discussion around 24-hour cities, also thinking about expanding the hours of the day towards the night and make cities still accessible and safe at night. Then going into nocturnal governance, so really understanding how these governance structures look like in different cities, what worked in the recent years, what maybe didn't work, and then looking into financial issues, both from the perspective of the workers and the individuals and vulnerable populations, but also the support for independent businesses. And then finally, the last chapter that's going to be published is about data, opportunities, but also maybe concerns that we have by collecting data and using data. And on the next slide, I jump right into it, and I'm really happy that Mark Adam Harold from Vilnius, Lithuania, who was the chapter lead of chapter number 1, I hand over to him to give us more insights about this chapter.
Hello, thanks Lutz, and thanks to the Institute for organizing this. I'm a bit of a geek for rules and enforcement, so I really enjoyed taking part in this whole project, finding out what was done around the world, finding out what didn't work. And when we wrote this, this was the first chapter. It's on outdoor nightlife, and it was published more than a year ago. So it was just at the time when, after the first wave, people were opening up, and there was a lot of experimentation, let's say, going on with rules and enforcement, and how to squeeze the most space out of a city. So if we go to the first slide, these are the problems that were happening, like because indoor events were restricted or completely shut down for a long period of time, because lots of businesses still had to pay rent, but they weren't making any money. This meant that they were clamoring for the rules to be relaxed. When the rules were relaxed outside, people were very stressed out by the lockdown, so they immediately went outside. There was a big boom in outdoor entertainment. And of course, because it's outdoor, these problems are very visible. Like everyone could see what was going on, could see the number of people, could hear the amount of noise, could see the problems, the litter. Whereas before, maybe a large portion of those people were doing their thing indoors and not disturbing anybody, and nobody really saw it. So it was a very public explosion of outdoor living. And also because there were many illegal parties going on both at home and outdoors, there was, I think, definitely in Vilnius, which was the city where I live and the city which we did a case study of, they were very keen to sort out these rules to try and reduce the number of illegal gatherings that are happening. So it's a classic case of when you've got a really chaotic situation, but you want to try and provide a legal framework for people to do things legally to reduce the harm done by what happens when they have no control and they're partying at home with no ventilation and no masks and nothing. So on the next slide, we can see some of the solutions that I found around the world. In Vilnius, as I said, we had pavement cafe liberation. What happened was the mayor just announced that you can extend your pavement cafes as long as you don't block the pavement. So basically, as long as someone could push a pram through, then that was the border of where your cafe could be. And many local communities, for example, like there's like 3 streets where there's a lot of cafes. They had a community meeting and they decided how to divide up the space themselves. And then all that the municipality had to do was just bless their decision and let them get on with their business. New York was even more radical, I think. At the start, obviously, New York's a much bigger city than Vilnius. They didn't have time for organizing community meetings and sorting out different ideas. So they just had a system where you just inform that you're doing an outdoor cafe, or you're extending your business onto the pavement, and you can get on with it. You don't have to wait for that to be approved. In Vilnius, you had to wait for your decision to be, for your map to be approved. In New York, they just let people get on with it, and they checked it later. And that actually worked surprisingly well in Vilnius and in New York. Things that would never have been considered without the pressure of COVID were tried out, and it turned out that the businesses and people organized themselves pretty well. In Berlin, there was, because there's a big tradition of having free parties outdoors, Berlin worked hard to find places where they could do free parties, and to have a minimal set of rules and recommendations and education for the organizers to try and minimize the harm. Again, it's better to have these things written down on a list where the authorities know that they're happening, and it's much easier then to avoid the biggest problems, which we saw in Paris, where they even had riots outdoors, and no way of regulating the riot legally. Orlando, I mentioned because it was very interesting. They have very good business networks. Of course, another American city, there's a big, long tradition of businesses getting together and civic action. So they had really good networks to find out where there could be more outdoor activity, to find out what's going on in the business scene. And I think they were a good example of the municipality and the state government working better with business, because, like Lutz said, places that have those frameworks in place really got a big benefit out of those frameworks when the pandemic hit. And Paris has an interesting approach. They have mime artists. For many years, they've had a group of mime artists that goes around the city and calms people down by doing theatrical performances and handing out information. And this, of course, was very useful when outdoor explosion happened. And there was even more need to calm people down outdoors. There was much more people outdoors. So that's a few of the innovative solutions that happened. On the next slide, I want to talk about my favorite topic after all of this experience that dreadful experience that we've been through. My favorite topic is communication. A lot of these discussions, we talk about the rules, maybe we talk about enforcement, but I've seen how influential good communication can be, especially in these fast changing situations. And I want to stress the importance of however good a framework you come up with, and however much you streamline bureaucracy, if you can't communicate those new rules to businesses and to consumers on one A4 sheet of paper with pictures, then there's a big chance that no one's going to follow those rules. I think in Vilnius, the rule of having 2 meters between a table lasted about 2 days. And there was just no communication, no enforcement, no reason for businesses to follow the rule, quite frankly. So here's 3 examples of posters. On the left, there's New York's campaign was one of the first and best to come out. They have a great slogan, "It's up to you, New York." They encouraged social responsibility. They have pictures. They have only 4 rules. Brilliant. The middle poster was the one I designed for Vilnius because the council didn't design anything, so people were putting up random posters written very badly designed. So I made one standard design like this, which has mostly pictures, only 6 rules, and at the bottom the slogan says, "We're from Vilnius, we act responsibly." So it was encouraging, like inspired by the New York campaign. On the right, we have this year's new poster, which the council, the city municipality made without telling me. I would have done it for free so that it wouldn't have been so terrible, but I think you can probably see, if you compare the middle one to the one on the right, the one on the right was stuck up in bars, in dark places, around corners, and nobody could read it. It's got pictures on the left, pictures on the right, it's all over the place. And the descriptions of the rules are overly bureaucratic. So this was an example of the municipality trying to communicate and failing because they didn't understand their audience. Whereas my organization decided we understand our audience better, we understand the situation. So we made our own poster. So that's one small example, but I've seen again and again, as this pandemic has developed, new rules have come in and there's been very bad communication to the public, when in reality that all of these people are in the place looking at the walls. You really just have to stick a good poster there and you can make a big difference. Otherwise, all of your amazing plans that you had for how you're going to license this activity just get ignored by the public. So if we go to the next slide, which I think might be the last. Yes. So I want to sum up by saying during making this report and the global experiment of the explosion of outdoor dining, these 4 words kept coming back to me. The first is proportionality. We had many examples of huge lists of rules which had no basis in science even, and were just overkill. Especially with nightclubs. For some reason, nightclubs get completely shut down for 18 months, whereas other businesses don't. So proportionality is very important for making people follow the rules, because they don't follow rules if they don't think it's fair. That's simple. I guess you probably all know that one. Enforceability is important, because I've seen many rules that were come up with that people dreamt up that could never be enforced. So it's a waste of time. Maybe start from what you think you can enforce, and that would be pretty much the end of the list of things you should do. Enforcement, it might be enforceable, but are you actually even doing the enforcement? I've been arguing in Vilnius for, since the start of the pandemic for more inspections and undercover inspections, and they're still not happening. I don't know why they spend so much time announcing rules which they're not enforcing. And the last one is transparency. If we knew how many places had been inspected, how many places had been fined, how many places had had virus outbreaks, if we knew all of that information, then it would be much easier to design better rules and adapt the rules as we go along. But I found a lot of places don't have those statistics open. I think you'll probably, we have a good example, another speaker later coming on who's going to be talking a lot about data, but that's been lacking. So that, I think, that's it from me. That was the first chapter. It was a pleasure to make. I hope if you've got any questions, we have another couple of minutes. I'll try and answer. But that's given you a taster of what happened all over the world when we tried to liberalize something in various ways.
Yeah, feel free to post your questions in the chat, in the Q&A chat, or I think that is the smartest way, since we have so many people joining in. If not, we can also catch up the questions a bit later. And yeah, I think we can go to the next chapter. And I would like to introduce Ricardo Ramello, and he will introduce himself a bit more in depth. And he's looking in the future of dance floors. And Ricardo,
hi,
over to you.
Hi everyone. Thanks, Lutz, for introducing me, and thanks to the Institute of Licensing for inviting us. I'm a PhD researcher based at Nottingham Trent University, and I'm about to finish my PhD in 2022 on nighttime economy and violence. And I'm also the founder of Club Futuro, which is an association based in Turin, Italy, that aims to raise awareness about the cultural importance of nighttime economy and clubs. And basically, when we decided to think and to imagine the future of dance floors, it was the time when basically all the clubs were closed, were inactive. It was around last August, and we decided to look at different tactics, new tools, and experimentation and models that could be an inspiration for other practitioners, for other professionals around the world. And this is actually a collaborative work. So I worked with Michael Keel from the Nighttime Industries Association. I worked with Alessio Cugliolis, who is a teaching fellow at the Bartlett Development Planning Unit. Professor Fiona Misham, who is the founding of the Loop Association. She's also the chair in criminology at the University of Liverpool. And Rob Van Bogart, the founder of Evensure, and finally Lauren Goczynski, who is a member of the International Cities of Advanced Sound. Sorry for the long introduction. Let's go to the next slide. So basically, to give a little bit of context, when we wrote the Future of Dance Floor, of course, all the clubs were closed, and there was a deep lack of clarity in what the reopening stages would look like. And of course, venue managers were under a very unprecedented stress. And of course, clubs were often seen as an unsafe and uncontrollable kind of environment. In Italy, it's still the same. After 2 years, clubs are still closed, and dancing is completely banned. And also, we knew that in clubs there were already some issues like racism, sexism, and other kind of social issues that would be probably exacerbated by the COVID. And of course, institution didn't support very much clubs and dance floors. In Italy, I think that for the first months was very difficult to actually get any kind of financial support. Next. So we decided to look at the right side and to find different tactics and models, as I said, from places around the world. And we saw that there were some opportunities. So there was an opportunity for new types of business approaches. So more flexible, startup-oriented kind of approaches. And also, it was a time where new types of frameworks and toolkit could be invented and envisioned. And also, it was also an interesting moment to measure and monitor the changes in how people lived and how people reacted to the COVID, and also all the possible impact, economic impact, and so also the economic value of that sector. And of course, it was also a moment where networking and advocacy started to happen, like spontaneously happen, because of course there was this sort of uncertainty which somehow like reunited a lot of people that were very fragmented in the past in terms of music scene and venues and clubs. And next, we could see that actually some interesting models were coming from, for instance, from London, where the Village Underground basically set up a cycle park in order to keep the space active, but also to create a new narrative around their project. And also, for instance, in Seoul, South Korea, they actually decided to team up with other players, with other nighttime players, and they created the first Korea Club Culture Association to support each other. And in Belgium, the Evensure basically created a framework for COVID-19 management, and then other people from another world created their own type of framework to manage venues and to actually support practitioners in this uncertain time. And from Turin, actually, a very interesting virtual model of clubbing was created with the possibility to actually create an avatar inside this virtual world and meet other people in a very exotic, very flamboyant kind of virtual environment. And so we actually also started to consider this presence of virtual life that with the COVID had a very strong boom, and we started to think the pros and cons of virtual life, and we came into to a conclusion that actually virtual clubbing shouldn't replace entirely and couldn't replace entirely the physical experience, but of course can be very helpful to actually create different contents, complementary contents, and to engage the community, to create new form of communities and engagement. So like our key points were, of course, digital literacy, because we realized that actually the general digital literacy was very low when COVID happened, and also like these tools that could be used to actually adapt your business plan and your management practice to actually create like better and more livable and more sustainable, socially sustainable venues should also stay after the COVID and after the emergency. And we also proposed an interesting framework, which is the equality framework, which basically is a toolkit that considers 4 different elements in the club environment, which are the artists, the venue itself, the staff, and of course the visitors, and consider different aspects related to space inclusion, health and control, artistic expression, and basically give people and professionals a way to actually question themselves and question their practice based on this social and cultural framework. It could actually help venues to communicate themselves in a better way, and also create more fair and socially sustainable kind of environment. And next, I think it's the last one. So in terms of like what can the Institute of Licensing learn from this? I think that data management policy are very important, are becoming very important. I personally work with data with my PhD, and I think that, for instance, licensing authorities in the UK are very fragmented and inconsistent in terms of like the data they shared, for instance, about the licenses and the number and types of venues in each city. So, for instance, it's very difficult to access this data, and they are they come with different formats. And I think that, for instance, to monitor the impact of COVID and to study the ways how COVID will impact nighttime economy and clubs would be very interesting if, for instance, researchers could access data in a simpler way. And also, it would be very interesting to also assess qualitative and cultural factors. So let's focus on a more qualitative kind of framework, and less economic and less market-oriented kind of framework. And also, we saw that independent and vulnerable venues should be valued and protected, because they don't have like the capital and the resources to adapt and to thrive in these uncertain times. And so there should be some program addressed to those kind of venues. And I saw that on your website that you have some very interesting educational material and courses, and it could be very interesting to actually maybe create new courses or new material based on a more sociocultural approach to address those topics that I discussed in the previous slides. And I think that's it. I'm here available to answer to your questions.
Thank you, Ricardo. And that's also, of course, one of the key issues, how we can create a vibrant nightlife that is not focusing solely on the economic side, but also on the social and aesthetic side of the night. And this is, I think, a very good jump into the next chapter, actually, to look into 24-hour cities, where we also talk about illumination. I'm happy to introduce Lenny Schwendiger, joining in from the US, and Alistair Turnham from London, and hand over to you both.
Great. Thanks very much, Lutz. I'm Alistair Turnham from Make Associates. We do a lot of work around nighttime economy strategies and licensing. I know some of you here today. And I was lucky enough to be invited to lead this chapter on how we create more innovative, more exciting, more joined up cities at night. And the person I really wanted to work on this is Lenny. So I'm going to hand over to Lenny now to introduce herself a bit. She's the world's leading sort of specialist on nighttime design, on lighting design, and it's been a privilege to work with her and the other collaborators on this project. Lenny.
We don't hear you at the moment. Maybe you're on mute.
Hi, everyone. How does that work? Is that good?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to say my profession is urban lighting designer. That's a real thing. And then we're inventing nighttime design. Thank you, Ali, which is the idea that we can holistically design through the disciplines of architecture, landscape architecture, lighting, and all the ways that the nighttime in cities is involved. And so I invite you all to become nighttime designers, by the way. Thanks.
Thanks, Lenny. Okay, so next slide, please. So why did we want to write this chapter? Well, firstly, both of us have been talking a long time about the historic lack of planning and integration of nighttime services. So that's things like lighting, as Lenny just mentioned, but public safety, safe space design, urban movement design, transit, how we get in and around the city, not just public transit, but active transit. And one of the very important points about our chapter, which we're very passionate about, is how nighttime is public space. It's everybody's space, and everyone should feel safe in accessing it, whatever time of day. Nighttime is not just nightlife, and I think that's a really important distinction that our chapter tries to explain and to give examples of. Currently, virtually nowhere is less than an 18-hour-a-day town. Pretty much everywhere is a 24-hour city. And so while Lenny's in New York, and that's the city that never sleeps, in reality, pretty much every city never sleeps anymore. It's just that we fail to catch up to that with our infrastructure and with our services to support that. One of the things that we noticed about early on and wanted to talk about in the chapter is how COVID premiumized the idea of space, so that it was at short supply because of social distancing. And so one of the things that we try to talk about in the chapter is how to extend that temporally later into the night. And of course, that's not without conflict. And we've seen some of those conflicts where later licensing, later opening has created problems. And we'll come back to why we think we can manage that a bit better in the future. One of the things that COVID's also taught us, I think, is how quickly change can happen when it's forced upon us. And so in terms of consumer behavior, and that might be, people staying at home more initially, then wanting to come out, perhaps many people being conservative or a little bit timid about coming out. That's really changed, and people have stayed locally. And that has really big implications for how we design cities and how we integrate the services, particularly at night. Because night is, if you're a key worker, not discretionary. or any other kind of nighttime worker. But if you're going out for nightlife or hospitality, then it's very discretionary. And one of the things we talk about in the chapter is how to get those people to come back out more, who might be a little bit more nervous still. And that's still the case to some extent. One of the things that we're going to have to face, there was predictions of the death of the office. And of course, that's not happened, but it has changed radically. And so over the next 5 to 10 years, our town and city centres are going to look very different to what they have done 5 years previously. And one of the arguments that we make in the chapter, we've been making for a long time, is that not taking the nighttime seriously and creating the right type of services, the right infrastructure, the right communications is economically illiterate. In the UK, the nighttime economy is worth over £100 billion a year to UK PLC, and it employs 2 million people. And that's just directly, not the supply chain. So it's something that we've realised through COVID has become much more important that we take it seriously and we support it. In reality, the actual responses to that have been very fragmented and probably not very good, as many nightlife advocates would say, probably anywhere in the world. So Lenny's and my point in this chapter with the other collaborators is that this change forces on us a need to create a new strategy for the night. And I'm going to hand back to Lenny now, who'll take you through our conceptual idea about how you go through that process.
So I have to thank everyone at GNRP VibeLab for introducing Ali and I. We might sound like great colleagues and friends, but we were introduced through writing this chapter. It's just really a major moment for us to come together in regards to the aesthetics, let's call it, or the operability of the night, the place that is night, as well as the economic and therefore also social issues that are brought to bear. So I am bringing in this night seeing activity, which is walking with people at night. I've been doing this for a decade, walking at night, pinpointing what it's like at night, learning about our own districts that we want to improve at night. And Ali's been doing the night audit for, similar or more number of years. What is it like at night, looking specifically at open hours and closed hours and the economics of it. So we are measuring the night to find out who is using spaces, circulation, open and close, and for me, lights on, lights off. Next slide, please. So here we have shades of night, and I'd like you to use this all in a sentence within this month. Shades of night really wants to say, the sun just went down. What's happening in my neighborhood? If people are going to the office, are they then retiring to the pub? If people are going to night school, perhaps they're going to, the university at night school because they work during the day. Recreation, we're going to the theater, we're going to cultural events. But in some neighborhoods, maybe that means basketball. Then the night shift, people coming on, key workers, or as we say in the US, essential workers, moving into the medical field, sanitation, security, coding. There's all kinds of night work exploding, especially as we can work remotely and move also through walking and through cycling throughout the night. And then the after hours recreation, the clubbers coming home. How do they intersect the night shift? In any case, Shades of Night is a framework you can use as a kind of a template to measure the transformation of light, the people moving through in your city. And then we also want to talk about the first and last mile of transportation moving into the night. And I'm going to hand over to Ali for our big slide.
Yeah, so we divided our chapter, and I won't go through this in any great depth. We divided our chapter into 3 sections. Activation, so that's like, how could you flex the regulations, and gave good examples of Liverpool supporting outdoor dining. Mark's already talked a lot about that, but also, for example, Sydney's done a lot of work on changing its planning regulations to allow new uses in certain districts where they were prohibited before. And then things like new activities. So how do we introduce more family-friendly activities into our town city centres? How do we enable that? COVID's helped us in that, particularly as a lot of them which can be outdoors, which was helpful at that point in time and continues to be so for many people. So things like night markets, outdoor screenings, cinema, festivals and events, etc. But you've got to design those spaces properly to allow that to happen. You've got to be able to get people to be able to get them home. And then I'd like to go back to the point that Mark made at the start, which was communication. One of the things that comes out in our chapter is you've got to communicate. It's not enough to just build it or open it and hope people will come. You have to communicate what's on. So the chapter talks a lot about communication strategies for getting people into town and city centres in the evening in a way that they feel comfortable with, which is safe, and so they know what is going on and how they're going to get home. So Lenny, I'll pass you back and you can talk about your expert subject in terms of illumination and lighting.
Sure, and just to underscore, we haven't used the word public space enough in our talk here, and we want to say that public space at night needs to be designed. And that here, I think that you can begin to think about the kind of experimentation that the other speakers have been talking about, which is creating pilots. We're trying things, beyond the outdoor seating and different open close hours and social distancing. Let's begin to try lighting pilots, whether that's DIY lighting, fairy lights, swag lights, doing that in new ways, whether that is lights on, lights off, private lighting, public lighting from the government, how those two interact. Because the thing is that light is adaptable. It's a great material. It can be bright, it can be dim, it can be colorful, it can be white, it can be shadowing, and therefore we can use the transforming qualities of light for wayfinding and attraction. Now I want to bring up my first mile, last mile ideas in regard to getting people off public transit to work and from work to public transport, to home. What is it like for the night worker, the night shifter? How safe is it? How about women who work in the various mainly female occupations needing to get home and back at night? The UN has done studies that women are in danger. What about women who are afraid to even go out at night? Let us encompass the women and families of our global citizenship to make night a better place, and then it will be for everyone. Ali?
Yeah, thanks, Lenny. I'll just briefly talk about movement and say thanks to Carlos Pardo, who helped us write this particular element of the chapter. Carlos is a world-renowned expert on sustainability and active travel. We worked quite closely with him on this chapter. And I'm just going to give you one example. I came up with this idea many years ago of night proofing. That is that in terms of how what we found, and it still stands today, and we see it very clearly in the response to COVID, is that decision makers, policy makers, practitioners are really, really not very good, and licensing is probably an exception to this, but not very good at thinking about how their services, which they design for the daytime, work in the evening. And one of the things that we advocate in the chapter is about night proofing, is making sure that every policy, every intervention, every project properly works at night, not just during the day when the people in the office are designing that project as politicians, as civil servants. And sort of one of the things I'll give an example in the chapter is that TfL, one of the first things, a very good transport authority in many respects, but one of the first things, like Madrid, like other cities, was it pulled its nighttime transport because it said, well, they can't afford it, there's not enough people on it, no one's going out at night. But of course, that's not true for key workers. 1.7 million people work at night in London. How are they getting home? Well, maybe they've got buses, maybe they've got cars, but many of them were using the night tube in London. Now there's financial implications for that, and we understand that, but it is very much a daytime thinking response. The alternative to that is the other side of what TfL did, which was a world-class communications campaign working with Imperial College London to look at the safety of tubes, buses, and other forms of transit around London, and doing regular testing for COVID, and then reinforcing the fact that there was none found on any of the vehicles or in the stations, through a public communications campaign. And that was a really important part of the project and of the chapter, was particularly at the early stages, was you must tell people that transport is safe, because at the start, intuitively, people felt that, wow, we're crushed into these spaces. These are like COVID incubators. But in reality, the actual amount of COVID that's been found or has been traced to people on public transit is absolutely minute. And in terms of supporting the infrastructure of the evening and the nighttime economy, the nighttime city, we need that desperately. You know, we can't rely on unintegrated and personalized transport. So that was probably the most important part of the movement chapter. And thanks to Carlos for helping us with that. Next slide. And just to finish, we set out a process about how you could implement projects, perhaps in a more rational way, perhaps in a more structured way, because at the early stages of COVID, everybody was running around trying to come up with something that would work in a rather frenetic and desperate way. And I'm just going to pick out 3 of those. I'm going to ask Lenny to speak about community engagement, which has often been missing from many of the responses to COVID. Lenny.
Yeah, you know, we've all talked a bit about community participation and engagement, and I think it's a kind of the buzz phrase, and we believe in it. What I wanted to chat about is that there's successful community engagement and there's unsuccessful, and it's not for me about surveys and voting. What do you like? You know, what do you don't like? That's too general. We need to add education and community development, community involvement, community participation, which includes the sort of communication piece that we've been talking about. So let's work on our methodologies for engagement and make them better, which will bring us, you know, more input and more customers and a better place at night. Ali?
Thanks, Lenny. So a very direct result of community engagement is reducing the level of conflict, and I mentioned it earlier. When you have a laboratory, I dare to use the term Petri dish, given COVID, but a laboratory, an urban laboratory, and this once in a generation, one hopes, opportunity to reconfigure how things work. Community engagement has been vital and has often been missing some of these projects. So if you look at cycle infrastructure, if you look at some of the low traffic neighborhoods, traffic reduction, parklets, and taking back space for outdoor dining, etc. There was very little of that early on, and that's to some extent understandable. One of the things to counter often noisy voices or vested interests or lobby groups who are often funded by people who and corporations who have vested interest in not seeing any change happen, is to measure impact. And I know Mike will talk a bit more about that in chapter 7 in terms of getting the right data. But what we know, for example, in low traffic neighborhoods in London and around the rest of the UK, is that these changes have broadly been welcomed by most people in surveys, and that can then be used to communicate that it is safer, people are generally supportive of them, and that they have changed their behavior as a result. And for that, for us, for Lenny and I, that communications and advocacy role is really, really important, because in a world that is increasingly driven by emotion, having rational facts at hand is an important part. It won't win the argument, but it's there to underpin the emotional argument that we should be making for investment in the nighttime economy and for sustainable change. So last slide. Thank you. Thank you. Last slide. Yes. So one of the things that Lenny and I thought, but 12 months on, was licensing in particular has been a laboratory or a crucible or a test bed. You can insert your own applicable term there for the cutting edge of adaptation to COVID-19. And I suppose we'd like to end with a question for you as licensing practitioners, or people who have an interest in licensing, is how can it continue to enable life at night and to promote and support it rather than restrict it? Thank you. Thank you, Landy. Thank you.
Thank you both. Beautiful, wonderful chapter, so important. Especially we have also now an idea to, how to look into post-pandemic and really redesigning our inner cities. So thanks for this. And moving on, because time is running, to the next chapter. And as I also said, please use our Q&A. We are happy to, everybody's here, so we're also happy to answer questions there. And also in the end, we're gonna have a small panel discussion that we also happy to pick up ideas. So next speaker up is Tara Duvier. She's joining in from New York City, and her chapter is looking into the vulnerable side of nightlife, the workers behind the scenes. And Tara, I hand it over to you.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone here. My name is Tara Duvier. I'm Senior Planner at Pratt Center for Community Development, which is within Pratt Institute. Pratt Center for Community Development works for a just, equitable, and sustainable New York City in partnership with community-based groups, small businesses, and the public sector. So again, my chapter was focusing more on nightlife workers and coming up with support models for nightlife industry workers, individuals, and vulnerable populations. So next slide. It was very important for us in the beginning to really note who we were talking about when we say nightlife workers, not just DJs and promoters. These people cross industries and specializations, and they are all critical pieces to the nightlife economy. Definitely so many were impacted globally when you think about all of the folks that come together to make nightlife the experience that it is for so many people around the world. So many people saw their income dissolved practically overnight, many without any avenues for relief due to their worker classification. For example, in the States, many nightlife workers are not formal employees and salaried, which makes applying for unemployment insurance a challenge. Many freelancers were left out. Governments did respond to allow for a wider classification of employee to apply, but still many were not eligible for any financial relief. Some of that, again, due to the worker status, some due to legal status. So people for many, in some cases up to 18 months, even continuing today, are not able to seek any type of financial relief due to unemployment as a result of COVID. Next slide. So when our team began to meet, we really, we started to have some really good conversations. Many of us already do work in nightlife. In addition to my work at Pratt, I also am a DJ and an event promoter. So anecdotally, I knew of folks who were experiencing issues. I myself, to a smaller degree, because it's not my primary source of income. And a lot of the folks that were on this chapter team also either worked within nightlife or worked very closely with people within nightlife. But it was really important for us to try to formalize this and try to do some level of outreach, which in a pandemic is very hard to do because we're not supposed to be together. So what we did is we did a global survey. We came up with just a Google form. We got a relatively small sample. We have about over 300 respondents across several continents to basically understand what they were experiencing and what their top needs were in this time. I mean, I think for the most part, we took a guess, but we really wanted to make sure that we were on the right path as to where we should be focusing our efforts. So next slide, please. So these are the top 3 needs that we learned through this survey. Cash, of course, and rent assistance. 98% of those that were able to receive some sort of monetary relief reported that it wasn't enough to sustain themselves. Many also reported declining mental health, which was to some degree surprising, but not. In many cases, people not only lost their jobs, but through nightlife, they lost a safe social space. For many people that work in nightlife, they're parts of groups that don't have the privilege of entering most spaces without being over-policed, without being discriminated against, and possibly being attacked. So taking that space away from people really had a significant impact on their mental health. The pandemic also really exposed the challenges within nightlife that made it a difficult landscape across the board. It does fall at nightlife falls at a unique intersection of culture and business, which does make it difficult to create policy to support it. I think there's also a general perception that nightlife is fringe and is stigmatized due to the perceived drugs, alcohol, and loud noise. Nightlife workers are also not organized and they're hard to reach. So many are from groups that, again, have been historically excluded, over-policed, attacked, person of color, queer communities. So there's really like a justified level of mistrust and a desire to remain fringe to some degree as a mean of protection, but it also leaves groups vulnerable to other forms of abuse in the work environment, which is something that we also saw in who we spoke with, and also some of the responses that we received. Some people just gave us, we allowed for a little open space for people to just tell us how they felt overall. And again, a lot of it really just had to do with feeling isolated, feeling out of touch with their support group, with their networks, but then also feeling like they really don't have other options as far as seeking other employment because of the groups that they belong to. Next slide. All right. So through our chapter team, we really were able to source examples of both short-term and long-term solutions. Long-term, of course, being more sustainable. On smaller informal levels, a lot of mutual aid groups emerged across the communities, not just nightlife, but especially within nightlife. People were immediately aware of the impacts of the pandemic on nightlife workers, and they were able to organize and raise funds to distribute resources. I'm sure this is not unique to the States, or New York rather, but definitely in New York, a lot of venues themselves organized mutual aid to assist their staff in acknowledgement of them not being able to remain open. So creating GoFundMes and other things that would be allow them to generate funds to distribute across their workers in order to help stabilize them. So all governments to a degree also provided emergency funds through expanded unemployment insurance, stimulus checks, and grants for artists. One such example of grants that we outlined in our chapter was in South Africa. They worked really quickly to determine the pandemic's impact on the creative sector and created a grant program that offered not only direct payments, but additional funding for digital and virtual programming to encourage people to stay home. On the more sustainable side, ensuring that the social safety net that exists in most nations is strengthened, particularly for nightlife workers who are often regarded as freelance or contract employees and lack typical worker protections, is really important. It is a really important solution that we feel needs to be pushed forward. There are, again, a lot of people were really like just the bottom was taken from underneath them overnight, and there was no protection. It took time for some of these short-term solutions to come into place, but if the social safety net overall was strengthened and made sure that all workers, especially nightlife workers, were included, something like a pandemic wouldn't have been so economically devastating so quickly for many nightlife workers. There is also something workers need to do, and it's organize and advocate. Which is why empowering workers is critical. Again, a lot of nightlife workers, based off their legal status, based off the groups that they are a part of that have been historically excluded, there's been a lot of disenfranchisement, a lot of issues around getting people to organize, and seeing the impacts of other groups organizing during this time, especially venues. Particularly one example in the States would be the National Independent Venue Association. They were created in March of 2020 to basically advocate to the federal government for legislation that would provide funding to carry them through and allow them to sustain until they were able to reopen. So from March 2020 to the end of last year, they were able to pass federal legislation, their Save Our Spaces Act. And that type of organizing within such a short period of time, of course, they're businesses, so they're able to do that. But if we could see that on a worker level, I can only imagine like the changes that would take place if we were able to organize as they were. Then also in terms of long-term solutions, we also presented a case study in private partnerships that's taking place in the Netherlands, where a foundation was created in Groningen that aims to directly match businesses seeking to support and create projects and events through tax-deductible donations while providing creatives access to funds that they need without having to go through other means of obtaining funds, which can be very challenging and very competitive. So that's another long-term solution that we outlined in our chapter, in addition to some other solutions, but these were some of the main takeaways that we wanted to focus on, identifying what the issues are, but then presenting some solutions, both short and long-term, that would assist in making sure that nightlife workers are able to support themselves in the event of another devastating economic event. Next slide. So in closing, I just want to speak a little bit more to worker empowerment. These are some of the issues that nightlife workers are dealing with in New York City. That's not to say that this is unique, and these are just a few. And a lot of these existed prior to the pandemic. And I know that there are similar issues that are being experienced in other cities. There are barriers that are preventing large-scale organizing around these issues from happening. There's a fear of retaliation and a fear of blacklisting, to the need for real policy change. We need to remove those barriers and help bring awareness and encourage and facilitating organizing opportunities with nightlife workers so that we can build a nightlife economy that is inclusive, safe, and equitable in order for it to be truly sustainable. That's all. Thank you. If anyone has any
That's all, folks.
I encourage you all to read the chapter. It's very like trying to condense it into 10 minutes versus actually it really needs to be read. There's just some other really great solutions that are being that we present, but it was just too much to get into one presentation.
Yes, thank you, Tara. I mean, we also have executive summaries of every chapter. We wanted to make it as easy, as digestible as possible, but there is also a lot of information. So take your time, read it through. We'll share also the link that you can download it very easily. Thank you, Tara. We have a hand from Steve Brown. Please, you should be able to talk if you open your microphone. Steve? The stage is yours, if you want it. Okay, we will try again later and go to the next slide and into the next chapter, which is chapter number 5. And Andrena and Nandor will introduce themselves.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Nandor Petrovic. I'm working as an assistant lecturer and a doctoral researcher at the Corvinus University of Budapest. You can see this beautiful city behind me, and I'm here to present our chapter focusing on nighttime governance together with Andrena, who was the co-lead of the chapter. Andrena, would you like to say something in the beginning?
Oh gosh, oops.
It was not Andrena, maybe.
No, that was Steve.
Okay.
let us introduce Andrena quickly, and then we let Steve ask his question. Okay. Andrena?
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrena Seijas. I'm a senior consultant at Eden City, a firm based in Barcelona, Spain, and I collaborated in this chapter with Nandor, which draws from my doctoral studies on nocturnal governance. And I'm very happy to be here and share some of these thoughts and lessons learned with you.
Wonderful. Before you guys start, we try again to have Steve ask his question. Steve, hello? Okay, I think we move on and catch up later.
Yeah, we can answer all the questions at the end of the presentations. So hello again. Before the presentation, I just would like to thank to all the contributors who were that we were able to put this chapter together. I think it was a great effort from everyone. Here we aim to provide some practical insights from the perspective of advocacy organizations and also policymakers, and encourage cities to create their own nighttime strategies. And in this chapter, we are focusing on basically two questions. One is, how are nighttime governance institutions responding to the COVID-19 crisis, and how can they build local capacity to sustain and recover their nighttime ecosystems. Here we present case studies from Montreal, Helsinki, Tokyo, Vilnius, and Melbourne to illustrate how cities around the world have created different types of institutions in order to build their capacities to manage their nighttime economies. And the next slide, please. Yeah, thank you very much. So first of all, I would like to say a few words about what nighttime governance is. Night has been a highly regulated space normally, but the concept of nighttime governance is relatively new, and it means that we should move away a little bit from this highly regulated approach, and the night has to be managed in a strategic way to accommodate the needs and interests of all the stakeholders, those who are working, studying, partying, or sleeping at night. And our understanding was that a lot of actors are involved in this nighttime governance, which means that there is a broad ecosystem of stakeholders involved in managing the city at night. And we were looking for examples how they were able to better collaborate and support each other. And here you can see a small figure about the stakeholders, who can be and to which realm can they belong. Why is it important from the perspective of municipality? We can say that night scenes and nighttime economies have been affected by the restrictive measures introduced at the pandemic, which created a significant pressure on nighttime governance institutions. We will talk about these pressures later, but it also raised awareness of the high demand for leisure and cultural activities, beside of the economical importance of the nighttime economy. The role of night mayors and other nighttime governance institutions can be crucial because they are helping to create a sustainable nightlife by connecting stakeholders and building strong networks, besides of arguing for better nighttime software and hardware. We can move to the next slide. Just a few words about the different case studies we are presenting. Montreal was a very good example how a comprehensive nighttime policy can be supported by the broadening network and using participatory policy planning, because there was already a civic organization called MTL 2424, which was formed in 2017, which was really able to connect to the aims of the city, because in 2020, the city of Montreal appointed a commissioner for noise and night and started regular consultations with the civic organization in different working groups. And they also opened a public consultation to understand the perceptions and needs of citizens concerning a new nighttime policy. What we can see and we can learn from the case of Montreal is that the pandemic pushed the city to consult with civic societies and also other stakeholders to begin to develop medium and long-run plans and participatory instruments for developing sustainable nightlife and nighttime policy. Helsinki was a good example how the city can be connected to its local night scene by establishing a night liaison, because in Helsinki, the importance of supporting the city's nighttime ecosystem and strengthening the ties with the local government has already been acknowledged. But in March 2020, they were taking a very important step, and they were selecting the first night liaison in Helsinki. It was a challenging situation for them, because not just because of the pandemic, but because the scope of activities was also not clear back then. But still, this new institution was already successful in some issues that we can learn from. For example, they were able to draw attention on the small and diverse cultural activities. They were able to convince the city to develop new ways to make the public spaces more accessible. And also they were reaching out to researchers and universities and starting to gather reliable data on the value of the city's cultural and nighttime economy. Tokyo is a very influential case, I think, because it is a good example of how national government can be influenced by using strong networks and trusted relationships between nighttime actors. In Tokyo and in Japan, the Japan Nighttime Economy Association, GNEA, has already been a prominent actor which was able to build a network of creative and nightlife business operators, and also established a good cooperative partnership with different governmental organizations. So using these partnerships and this network, right after the beginning of the crisis, the GNEA, in collaboration with several other organizations, was able to submit a concrete set of proposals to support music, entertainment, food service, and other sectors like tourism. These proposals included proposals for emergency loans, rent subsidy for venues, also increased compensation for workers, and so on. GNEA was successful in playing a double role, and we can learn from this role that they were able to act as an interface between the private and public sectors, involving different players from different sectors. And also the GNEA was acting as a policy advisor for political decision makers with the ability to grasp the reality of nightlife and translate the needs from the nighttime sector. The next case study was Vilnius, which is a good example of how to build capacity from the grassroots to support communities. Because in Vilnius, a grassroots art community called Republic of Užupis initiated several innovative solutions in order to support the city's vibrant nighttime economy. They started, for example, a cultural exchange platform where they were making connection between nightlife players like venues, artists, and musicians, and also with the audience. They were also establishing a digital art gallery supporting artists, and also a research center which was focusing on collaboration between artists and other stakeholders. What we can learn from the case of Vilnius, that the creative approach and the tangible ideas can attract people, and also local awareness and capacity can be built on informal methods and strongly rely trust and grassroots organizations which can create their own creative solutions even without a direct support from the government. The last case was Melbourne, where we can see that nighttime governance can be used as an experimental space, putting academic knowledge into practice. Melbourne suffered from one of the strictest and longest lockdowns around the world, but for answering the question how to recover, knowledge exchange is a good approach at the border of policy and education, and this is what we can learn from the case of Melbourne. Since 2018, at the University of Melbourne, there is a organization called Connected City Labs, which is running a studio offering a venue to gain interdisciplinary and policy relevant understanding of urban planning for the students. One section of this Connected Cities Lab called Studio M, which represent an educationally oriented laboratory to make experiments with nighttime governance issues and ideas emerging from the lab's research program on nighttime policymaking. And this studio also serves as an informal touching point for the city of Melbourne and the local nighttime experts to test ideas that may eventually become part of official policies later on. Last slide, please. And here is the point where I'm giving the floor to Andreina for our last arguments.
Thank you, Nander. So to keep moving with the final part of our chapter, one of the questions we asked ourselves when working on this chapter was, what can we learn from all these case studies? Or in other words, how can we operationalize this knowledge into tangible actions? And one thing that is very certain is that each city is very different. And while it is possible to transfer knowledge from one city to another, we need to take into account local needs, local governance traditions, and local regulations, which vary very much. And this was at the heart of my doctoral dissertation at the Harvard GSD, which looked into the evolution of local governance in 3 different cities. And with Nander and other people and all the contributors of this chapter, we looked into other case studies to broaden this emergent field of nocturnal governance and try to narrow it down to a set of elements, a set of steps that cities can take when they want to create an office of nightlife or a nighttime office. And these steps are the following. So the first is, and there's an order here, but you don't have to take them as like a one by one. Like they don't have to follow like the first, the second, the third, but it's just a set of things, that recommendations that cities can do when they want to create a nighttime office. One of them is to craft a nighttime vision for your city. And this is very important because cities have to start with a plan. And when we think about nocturnal governance, it tends to happen that cities have been traditionally and historically very reactive. And right now, what we're recommending here is to start by crafting a document that summarizes what are the city's aspirations, to plan for the long term, to look beyond political cycles and to set targets into which direction the city wants to move to. And this can be done through participatory mechanisms, such as the ones that Nandor mentioned in Montreal, as well as workshops, surveys, and even through participatory instances through universities like the one that was done in Melbourne. A second thing that cities can do is to measure their night scenes. And this basically calls for to start from data, to don't improvise, but to look at the size and the distribution of the nighttime economy as a starting step to be able to craft then a strategy for your city. So this involves mapping your nighttime activity, understanding how existing regulations shape nocturnal ecosystems, and creating different concrete elements to measure and to track them over time. And here, of course, one very important tool, a very useful tool that cities are using for this is a creative footprint that has been put together by VibeLab. And that's something that could be very useful for your city when you want to measure your night scene and to start from scratch. Another element is to raise awareness, and this refers to how we can involve citizens and public opinion in the process of nighttime planning and design. And a key step is to change the negative perceptions around the night, share what the night is actually about, all the contributions, the good and the bad, and also to help demystify what the nighttime economy and nighttime activity is in urban areas. Another element is to build a team. And this is very important because we constantly talk about night mayors, and we think that the night mayor is a one-person job. This goes beyond a one-person job. It involves having a team with different abilities and different skills, including urbanists, communication experts, legal experts, and data scientists. So it's important to have both the institutional backing, but also the financial structure that will allow these institutions to transcend over time. And also to work with different levels of government, which is something that we have seen in these different case studies, how when it comes to managing the night, this happens in different levels of government. So for instance, in some countries, like in the United States, you have how alcohol regulations do not happen at the city level, but at the state level. So you have to have in place these institutions that are able to have a dialogue with these different levels of government. Another element is how you have to connect and support with local networks. And by this, we mean to connect with local community boards, business improvement districts, chambers of commerce, resident associations, workers associations, in order to have a clear picture of what's happening in the city at night. Also, as it was said before by other contributors in the other chapters, we believe in experimentation as a very important aspect of planning the city at night, and how pilot projects can be a great way to test different ways of managing the city at night. And for instance, cities like Bogota in Colombia right now are testing how different hours of operation can have a better impact in key districts of the city, and modeling their nighttime strategy and regulations based on that. And then, of course, we have to learn and educate. As we said, there's negative perceptions and negative associations with the night, and we need to change those perceptions by educating and sharing best practices, as Melbourne, for instance, did with the students. And then finally, we need to embrace change. Nighttime governance institutions have to be flexible. And this is something that was one of the main lessons learned from this crisis, how we constantly see a very tough oscillation from very restrictive measures to then opening up and then closing again. So in order to be able to handle these changes, we need to have strong institutions that also have the flexibility to bounce back from shocks and from crisis. And one of the things that we asked, one of the questions we asked when writing this chapter was, should night mayors have a broader scope? And this is one of the things we learned throughout the case studies, and also by looking at other cities like New York or London. We can see how in some cases night mayors were created with a very specific mandate, but this mandate has evolved or grown over time. So it's very important that these institutions have certain flexibility in order to be able to respond to constant changing environments. And the idea with the chapter and with this final toolkit is not to prescribe solutions, but to share useful ideas on how cities can tackle managing their nighttime spaces. And we hope that these steps can be informational and useful for you and your cities. And we're happy to share with you any more insights on these cases, as well as to answer any questions you might have.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andreina. Thank you, Nandor. Looking at the time, I think we're jumping right into the next chapter, and hand it over to also our host for the discussion later on, Philip Colvin. Philip, we don't hear you yet.
Can I be heard now?
Yes. Loud and clear.
Excellent. Lutz, thank you very much indeed. I'm not sure if I can be seen, but if I can be heard, that's actually good enough. It's been very wonderful to work with your team. This chapter actually sits alongside the chapter that Andreina and Nandor have just presented, and essentially the theme of this chapter is what can the state do to assist the nighttime industry to recover from this pandemic and to find itself a secure basis for the future. And although I'm on the front of this chapter, this is a joint work by 11 of us from 4 different continents. So I hope that I can do this chapter justice, just speaking by myself. The role of the state, we think, in the governance of the nighttime economy has traditionally been regulatory. It grants permissions, it monitors, and it enforces. And in the UK specifically, this has meant things like cumulative impact policies, core hours policies, framework hours policies, and other regulatory tools. And in a world in which there is infinite land, infinite resources, infinite money, that would be enough. The system would be there to tame the worst of the operators. But these days, that's not enough. We've already seen the influence of cheap alcohol from shops, reducing what is sold through bars. We've seen the rise of online entertainment, diverting customers from town and city centre premises. We've seen the rise of Deliveroo and Uber Eats, diverting custom from restaurants. We've seen land values driving out new and independent operators, and we've seen gentrification and all of its consequences. So over the years, certainly in the UK, we've seen a steady erosion of pubs and nightclubs and LGBT spaces. And really, it was evident to all of us working in this field at the start of the pandemic that this was only likely to be accelerated once the pandemic took hold. And so it has proved. And in the UK, at least, we've now seen a loss of security staff, of hospitality staff. We've seen rising food prices, and we've seen operators coming back into the industry with huge amounts of debt, which is going to cause more closures in the time to come. So we're forced to confront, is the nighttime economy, is nightlife something we want to support? And the answer, of course, to that is unequivocally yes, from an economic perspective, from a cultural perspective, from an equality perspective, from the point of view of reputation and tourism of our towns, cities, and nations. And so the thesis of our chapter is that if that's what we want, we have to move to a new mindset, not just as regulators, but as creative supporters, using all the levers of the state to create conditions for revival and growth. And that means partnership. And none of this is new language. When we're planning for housing, for regeneration, for education, for roads, we don't do it in some sort of random way. We set out a vision, and then we use the levers of the state to achieve that vision. And that was the vision which Andreina was talking about just a few minutes ago. And
Philip, just quickly, I think if you want to have the next slide, you have to say next slide, please.
I'm going to move to the next slide. And I think what we've really come to realize from the working of the Global Nighttime Recovery Plan is that this exercise is a discipline. It's not a random exercise, it's a discipline. So in our chapter, we are talking about the discipline that the state needs to engage in order to promote this economy. Strategic thinking, using its levers to create conditions for revival and growth. Can we move now to the next slide? The first aspect of this is to measure. And what you wish to measure is always a matter of the local circumstances, but the purpose of measurement is to understand the makeup of the sector, to identify gaps in provision, to provide a baseline, and then to measure success against the baseline. And there's all sorts of good work as to what can be measured: the venue, numbers of venues, types, hours, jobs, economic outputs, footfall, customers, ages and demographics, who comes into the nighttime economy and who doesn't, crime data and perception of the nighttime sectors and night spaces. There's endless lists of what can be measured, but measure what is right for your economy. The next element in this, what we call virtuous circle, is to recognize the value of the nighttime economy. And really the point of this is to understand that the hospitality sector is not just a beast to be tamed, it's a social good. It's what makes us human. It's worth supporting. It covers almost everything we do when we leave work and we spend time with our friends and family. And so this means that you need to headline the nighttime sector in everything which you do as a town or city. That might mean creating a post for a leader of the nighttime sector, whether a minister, a coordinator, a tsar, or an ombudsman, to underline its economic, social, and cultural importance. I was rather impressed when I went to Austin, Texas, to see that they had a hook line for the whole sector, which was endlessly emblazoned around the city, which was Keep Austin Weird. It spoke of a commitment to the nighttime sector and a recognition. And perhaps the most impressive recent recognition of the sector has been in Berlin, where the Bundestag passed a resolution that included reclassifying music venues and clubs with a demonstrable cultural connection as cultural venues alongside the opera houses and the art galleries. And that has produced a series of benefits for that part of the sector, including taxation advantages of the sort which in other cities attach to, let's just call it, to the high part of the sector. But in Berlin, they recognize the importance to the popular part of the sector. The next element is to destigmatize. It's so easy to use a term like nighttime economy and people naturally recoil, and newspapers love the idea of pictures of people lying in gutters and so forth. We've got to do exactly the opposite and see the nighttime sector as something to be celebrated. In London, when I was part of the London Nighttime Commission, we just dropped the term nighttime economy and started using the term 6 to 6, recognizing, as Ali told you before, that the nighttime sector is not just the nighttime economy, it's everything which happens at night and something in which we are all engaged. And that means rebasing the conversation from how can we protect ourselves from the sector to how can we help it grow as a safe, welcoming, diverse and creative space. And then a very important point, which is to commit to the sector. How would you commit? Well, you might create a headline vision for nighttime. In London, we published a document called From Good Night to Great Night, which set out 10 founding principles for the nighttime sector in London. But there's many, many examples from Mannheim, from Bogota, from San Francisco, from Berlin, from Toronto, and so on. You might then create a body, such as the San Francisco Entertainment Commission, to work with and promote nighttime and create activity. Or you might set up something like the Berlin Club Commission, which again was there self-evidently to support the cause of Berlin clubs. But it's about a corporate commitment to the nighttime sector. And then moving forward, you would enshrine your commitment in policy, baking in that commitment and ensuring that it pervades nighttime activity for the benefit of the sector as a whole. And so you would bake it in to your planning policies, your regeneration policies, your licensing and cultural and corporate policies for your town or city. And there's many, many great examples of how this has been done. I think one of the greatest in recent years has been from Sydney, which has turned itself from a city which had largely turned its back on the late night economy to a city which has supported it and recognized its importance for international tourist appeal and the cultural development of the city at large. And as Andreina has spoken about, don't do this randomly. Do this based on a sturdy evidence base, use the data which you've accumulated from the measurement phase, and do it based on a proper public consultation involving all stakeholders. And there's examples of how that can be done in our chapter. But let me just dwell for a second on Sydney, which set out the main opportunities for the city to pursue. This included placemaking and all the things which go around placemaking, having coordination of placemaking, having a nighttime hub certification program, creating an acceleration program for municipalities within Sydney, reactivating underused spaces and so forth. Diversification, which recognized the importance of diversification within the nighttime economy, not just entertainment, but also retail and services, cultural events and food. Industrial and cultural development, so ensuring affordable spaces for the creative industries, often squeezed out of centres now because of gentrification. Connectivity, recognizing the importance of joining up spaces and enabling people in the first mile and the last mile to get to and from the nighttime sector safely, and changing the narrative so the nighttime economy becomes something which one supports rather than something one reacts against. And finally, the implementation phase. There are so many things which can be done. In the last year and a half, of course, financial has been a very important element. Financial doesn't just mean handing out to nighttime venues. It might mean things as small as reviewing license fees, reviewing property taxes, reviewing the way the sale of services is taxed, reducing or removing travel charges at night. It might mean regulatory. That might mean things like helping the nighttime economy to move outdoors, as we've done in our country in the Business and Planning Act. And we've heard many other places where this has been done. It might mean removing things like cumulative impact policies, as we've seen some of the more enlightened cities do here. And it might mean implementing agent of change, which started in New York and is now working its way around the world. It might be promotional, and it might be physical, recognizing that it's very difficult these days in densely populated urban centres to have late night music and dance venues. How are you going to work that out? Where are these places going to go? Think perhaps like Amsterdam thought, not just, oh, these things are a problem, but where can we ensure that young people are given the opportunity to dance? And Cecilia, if you can just jump forward 4 screens to the concluding slide. So what we're advocating is a change of mindset to how can we regulate to how can we partner, from doing to doing with, moving from a regulation of individual cases to a planned strategic approach, moving from snapshot policies to a planned economy based on a virtuous circle, and moving from policy in silos to a genuinely joined up approach involving the state, the third sector, and communities. So thank you very much indeed. That is presentation of chapter 6.
Wonderful. Thank you, Philip. That was great stuff. And there are also some virtual claps in the chat. Thank you for that. And we also have Anita joining in with who has a question. You should be able to open your mic. Anita? Not sure if this is a technical issue or
maybe people should encourage people to use the Q&A a bit more. We seem to be having trouble with that, aren't we?
Yeah, I think we will have a longer conversation afterwards, and we have a lot of people on stage, so we'll see where this leads later. So then let's move on to the next and last chapter, chapter 7, and it's not published yet. So what you get here is a preview, sneak preview, basically, and you will get it from Michael Fitchman. He's part of the core team, of the editorial team, also co-initiated the Global Nighttime Recovery Plan. He is a city planner and lecturer at UPenn, and he's joining from Philadelphia. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Lutz. First, I want to say as a member of the editorial team that this is just really special to see all of us in one place at one time. We've worked so hard over a year and a half on these issues that were, almost emergency level important when we got started. So it's pretty special what this group of people has been able to accomplish, and you should all be complimented. As Lutz said, I'm Michael Fitchman. I live in Philadelphia, and I'm a university lecturer and a city planner. I'm also a community organizer. I started a nightlife advocacy group here called 24 Hour Philadelphia. And I'm a member of our city council's Arts and Culture Task Force, where I proposed and am now designing our nighttime economy office, which will be new and hopefully operational next year. Much of which was based on the work that we did in this effort, the Global Nighttime Recovery Plan, because basically I was able to talk to policymakers and say, here it is, here are all the best practices. So it's really a testament to what this effort has given the world in terms of resources. So I'm here to tell you about the last chapter, which has been alluded to a number of times over the course of the presentations here, because data is kind of woven into each chapter as an important sort of subtext, and Philip talked about it a great deal and stole a little bit of thunder from me, so you might hear a couple themes referenced twice. But I think it's very important that we understand the opportunities and limitations of data and measurement as we sort of gather ourselves through these hopefully last phases of the pandemic and into the development of a new future that is hopefully one that is superior to the past, which came before the pandemic, in terms of the conditions and opportunities and creativity in nightlife industries. Next slide, please. And there I am. Yes, my photo phased in there. That was look at that handsome guy. Okay, so why is it critical for nighttime industries to engage with data? And most importantly, it's the language of public policy. So an argument is on its face not particularly persuasive in the court of public opinion unless it's attached to some numbers and some evidence base. And data related to the nighttime city need to be improved. There are many things which are unmeasured. There are many things which are measured which do not have any sort of time-related dimension to them, so they can't be subdivided in terms of the way you understand economic activity or events that are measured in the urban space, whether they're happening at one time of day or another. As Tara mentioned in her chapter, workers lack good classification, so that economic outreach and relief was not really able to reach some of the nighttime specific industries where there are gray area relationships between firms and their workers. And as these data sources and the decisions and cultures that rise up around the use of data improve, we can improve decision making. And that is very much a governance thing. So from the government perspective, there needs to be more evidence-based decision making in dialogue with communities and industry groups and workers, but also for individual firms, for collections of firms, industry groups, decision making in terms of their direction and their advocacy priorities, their operations, and understanding of the facts on the ground in the economic landscape can be improved if the data is if the data collection and presentation is better from the government side and also on behalf of private parties. And so we need this compelling evidence-based engagement with the government and public stakeholders as a way to advance all our aims, including improvement of operations and protection of health, but also in terms of advocating for our priorities in a really crowded policy conversation. And also, as was mentioned several times over the course of the presentations, destigmatizing ourselves. And it's always, I'm sure many of you who are in this virtual lecture room have had a moment where you have met with a policymaker or some colleague or individual who finds themselves very surprised that people who are involved with nightlife speak in full paragraphs and make coherent points and have a sense of themselves in a way that defies their understanding of nightlife people as just being people who serve drinks, go to clubs, and all this other kind of thing. And so this presents us an opportunity to create a new standard, not just a standard for measurement and data collection, but standards for our governments and how they approach our industries, how they choose to measure the things that that we believe are important, and that is a tacit acknowledgement of the value that we bring to cities and communities. Next slide, please. So for this chapter is split up into, I guess it approaches two audiences. One, it has some elements for governments building their own data practice. And so many of you may be familiar with the London Data Store and their nighttime specific data portal, things of that nature, and programming and policy and evidence-based decision-making. But there's also a number of strategies for communities, NGOs, and industry groups who are looking to build a data-informed advocacy practice, which many have done over the last year in an ad hoc or sometimes more systematic fashion. And so in order to do this, there are a number of steps or practices that one needs to tackle. You need to understand available data sources, what is measured by either third parties, be that private data providers that you can access on economic data, what is collected and published by the government, what is collected by the government but not published and can be subject to various open records requests depending on which country you are in. And once you understand those, you can see what analyses are possible given what's been done out there before, or what your imagination or your priorities lead you to want to analyze, and where there are gaps, you can create your own data. So the canonical and often variously attributed phrase, not everything that can be measured is important, and not everything that is important can be measured, right? So the measurement of things about our world can best be done by people who understand our world. So I will give you some examples of that a little later, but suffice to say, I know there are lots of things that we think are important to operations of businesses or types of programming that no economist or government officer would ask about. Once you've collected and analyzed data, it's critical to communicate clearly. Data are hard to talk about because there are sometimes complex underlying technologies or analyses, and it's inherently kind of nerdy and dry. But being able to communicate with facts, figures, and graphics in a very brief and impactful way is critical. As my one of my co-contributors on this chapter, Paul Owens from Bob Consulting, says, data is political, and politics is very much about messaging. And that is a very important component of this. A good analysis is pretty useless if you can't communicate it. Technical challenges involved with collecting and analyzing data can be overcome with the creation of partnerships. Universities, VibeLab presents an excellent example of this. So it's a purpose-driven kind of consultancy of like-minded people who's working with governments who need expertise and capacity, works with myself, who I'm at a university, and in one's own community, you can build this model because many of these available actors are around. And everybody has a special kind of skill where you might have a computer programmer and a policy person from university, and the one thing they have in common is that they all enjoy or are inactive in nightlife, and they can be brought into these coalitions. And then you can incorporate data into your planning and decision making, and in all of this, being transparent and honest about limitations and biases associated with your data arguments are really critical to getting the best results and understanding exactly what's in front of you. Misinterpreting your data is perhaps just as bad as having no data at all. It leads you down a false path. Next slide, please. So here's an example from my own work, which is very much about the communication element and the making your own data element. So in Philadelphia, my group 24 Hour Philadelphia conducted a survey of nightlife patrons, artists, and industry professionals. And we wanted to try to understand that community's dimensions, priorities, and values. And so we asked a bunch of questions that were deliberately designed to both set our priorities as an organization in terms of what we wanted to focus on, whether that was harm reduction or policy advocacy, but it also presented us an opportunity to have a quantitative summary of our values, needs, and characteristics in a way that has become incredibly valuable. I can sit down in a room with a council member and say, did you know that 53% of artists or musicians in Philadelphia have considered moving to another market? And that is a very impactful piece of evidence that really animates people in a way where they think, I know that these industries have intrinsic value. I'm supposed to care about economic development. And that sounds to me like a problem. And this survey, which we conducted in 2018 and 2019, actually became the set of defining parameters for the Nighttime Economy Office proposal that we wrote last year on City Council Task Force. And so it's very much about creating the analysis to communication pipeline that really gets your work across. Next slide, please. Once you have some of those data, you can begin to make more complex analyses. And this is where I think those of you who have an interest in land use and sound and transportation and other things like that will begin to derive more value. So this is an example from the Creative Footprint Project, for which I'm the principal research analyst, going back a number of years with VibeLab. And this map, which you see, is, I will try to walk you through it because there's a lot on it, but suffice to say, it is the location of venues across the city of New York. Each bubble, the size of it is proportional to the number of venues in that neighborhood. And the color is proportional to the measured experimental content score for the venues there. And in a nutshell, what this tells us is that the densest areas in Manhattan have many venues, but relatively non-experimental content, whereas the gentrifying areas out into Brooklyn have a lot of experimental areas, which are pushing out into areas where the land values are lower. It essentially confirms a broad narrative about gentrification in the Lower East Side and in Brooklyn in New York, which was a truism in public policy discussions, but now it has some numbers associated with it. And this is the kind of stuff that gets you to a more complex place with policy discussions. Next slide, please. Perhaps the most advanced version of this kind of analysis, which is something I've been doing with my students recently, is incorporating artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the kinds of smartphone-enabled data sources that are becoming more pervasive in our society. So this is some great work that I did with my students, largely spearheaded last year, but this is point-to-point visitorship data where there are public policy analytics that we can create at a very powerful level. Essentially, we're looking at a commercial corridor here in the city of Philadelphia, and we know the origins of all of the people who have come to that place who are part of a network that is contributing cell phone data through third-party providers. And then we know things about the customer bases, we know things about the relative amount of footfall, and we can make all kinds of predictions for different scenarios. And this is sort of experimental stuff, but this is what the future looks like. But it's not without risks as well as opportunities. Next slide, please. So what can those of you who have an interest in licensing nightlife and entertainment and hospitality businesses learn from this or implement in your practice? So I think it's critically important to build local coalitions around data creation, analysis, and communication. It's not reasonable for everybody who is involved in this to have some ability or intuition for these kinds of practices, but it's good to build a group where you can bring many different kinds of skills and connections and opinions under one roof and really get the best out of your community. I think I would like to encourage everyone here to work with your local government to encourage nighttime governance, and then that governance should have a data component where data are collected, published, and analyzed in an agreed upon way. And so some of that should be to just enable your day-to-day operations. You could be able to find data which will help you make business decisions. You should be able to find data which allow you to go in front of like ministerial kind of reviews and licensing procedures and have the relevant facts and figures to make your arguments. And those data should be collected and published in a way that is available and convenient for you. It's important to consider the privacy liabilities associated with digital technologies. I've talked a lot about these third-party data sources, and depending on what part of the world you live in, these are variously available or variously invasive. And Mark Adam Harold worked with me on portions of this chapter in order to talk about what kind of privacy standards are important to have in place, perhaps beyond government privacy standards, which are mandated, in order to protect our patrons, especially people who are in communities which are somewhat vulnerable, where their location and behavior is supposed to be a private thing. But now that digital technologies have become an intermediary in every transaction, there are liabilities for them. And it's very important to keep them safe because really, like, that's us. That's our community. Not to mention the fact that these data sets are also have a lot of personal information by inference that could be potentially harmful to people. And I think it's also, as something to leave you with, it's important to think about alternatives to common analyses that we all make or are used to that are prone to bias or focus on the wrong values. And I would say that much of the focus on economic impact and on nuisance in conversations about nightlife is in need of some critical evaluation. For nuisance, for example, it is often focused upon in public policy discussions, and you have some accountability to the government about it, but it's not so much a measure of sound. It's often a measure of people who are willing to complain about things. This is the, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, did it make a sound kind of thing? There are many ways in which the way we engage data in the common issues of our world can be improved. And so I will leave it at that. And I'm very much looking forward to the publication of this chapter when that does come about, and looking forward to the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And the chapter is coming out very soon. We are now in the last stage of designing and distributing it, and we'll announce it. And in case you have signed up for any of the publications yet, then you also will be in the information newsletter that we're gonna send out. Yeah, to wrap it up and to also put it a bit in perspective, I would like, before we go into our panel discussion, which I'm also very looking forward to. Yeah, here on the last slide, thank you to all the contributors, to all the chapter leads that took the time today to present their vast information in a few slides into 10 minutes. If you would like to involve anyone that you heard, we are connecting you. Almost everybody here is also working as a consultant, as a researcher. So they're doing great work in their cities, in their country, on their continent, and VibeLab is happy to connect you to any one of them. And if you want to download it, you find all the chapters and the executive summaries on nighttime.org/recovery plan. So I think the time at the moment, why is it so essential now to look into all these issues, is because cities are changing. We see a big change in the retail market, what's happening to all these retail stores when people are gonna shop online. What happens to office space when people gonna stay in their home office 1 or 2 days per week. As a nighttime representative and an advocate, we have to sit at the table to discuss these changes of our cities in the next years. And to sit at the table, you have to have a governance structure, an advocacy role that represents your community. And so a lot of these topics that we touched on are so important now to put in place and to discuss, because things are also changing. And we also see that there are a lot of missed opportunities for many, many young people in a generation that maybe would be traveling all over the world and made their own experiences, and we have less tourists, less travelers to meet, that also are a big part of nighttime, and at what point we will also see that a lot of nighttime venues will also have to shut down on a midterm because there are not enough tourists coming because of travel restrictions. So let's hope for the best, but I think everyone here has a role to take, and hopefully we can provide you with this chapters, some useful information. So we had also a question in chat, sorry, and Martin Murray was referring to medium and small-sized cities that would like to develop 24-hour cities. And maybe we can use this as maybe an opening question. Philip, what do you think if by also bringing Carly Heat from Bristol into the conversation? And let's use these last couple minutes, and everybody who is not able to join for the next hour, thanks for contributing and thanks for being part of this wonderful project. Philip, you're on mute. I think you have to start again.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Lutz. I mean, it really has been an amazing afternoon. And I am going to start with Martin's question, but I'm going to sort of weave it into question about nighttime governance, quite a lot of the examples in the GNRP obviously relate to big cities, but not all the delegates here are from big cities. Some of them are from smaller cities or towns or even smaller places. So I just want to, can I just bring also, I think I'll bring Carly in here. And ask this question. Carly, we have night mayors, we have nighttime economy advisors, we have town centre managers, we have all sorts of different positions involved in this question of nighttime governance. You are the nighttime economy advisor for Bristol, which is a city of what, 300,000 or so people. Tell us a little bit about the challenges of bringing these ideas to bear in one of Britain's core cities, but nonetheless not one of its largest cities. Tell us about the challenges which you've had.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Philip, and hi, everyone. Great presentations from, it's been really, really interesting to listen. Bristol is a city the size of about 500,000, I think, at the moment. Our population has been rapidly increasing in the last few years. In our city, which is nice, we call it the mild wild west, in the West Country of England. We punch above our weight a bit when it comes to music, especially electronic music. And I suppose people move to Bristol because of the nighttime economy, because of the culture that comes out of it. And the actual governance of the night is something that's fairly new. I've been in position since March, but the night panel, which has been an advisory board, has only been in existence for about 2 years previous to my appointment. I think it's mad, as somebody that's been in Bristol for a long time, how we have only just started talking about the nighttime and having somebody to represent what happens after dark. And I think that every town and city should have one of me in it, because, you know, the needs of the night are so varied and so complex, but lots of the issues are the same from city to city. And I think that just by having open conversations amongst the different parts of I work for the Bristol City Council, so it's slightly different in every city as to where you sit within that local governance. But having so many conversations from licensing, planning, economic development, to keeping people safe on the streets, to making sure that in Bristol that people don't fall in the river at night because they got too close to the edge, or what all of these different issues might be. Having somebody to be able to speak to business, to those nighttime operatives, and then relay that back to the policymakers, I think is essential for any kind of modern city. And I think it's completely bonkers that we don't have this just as a standard in every town and city, certainly in the UK.
It doesn't matter whether, you're saying it doesn't matter whether it's a small town or a large metropolis. You need someone to have that bridging role.
Yeah, I think even in small towns, you still have local pubs, you still have local restaurants, you still, you know, the city doesn't stop the town doesn't stop at 6 o'clock. When you finish work, you're in the nighttime economy. And we need to make sure that we're doing this kind of cultural gardening to make sure that we're actually looking after these spaces. And whether you're a small town or a reasonable city or a massive metropolis, you know, these conversations are the same.
And have you found, Carly, in your job, I know you're very new to it, but that having that advocacy role, firstly, is it better that you're in City Hall, or would it be better if you were outside, in the way perhaps Mirik was outside in Amsterdam? And secondly, have you found it easy to open doors at City Hall level?
I would say where I am in Bristol, I'm in the city office rather than the mayor's office. And I know that even in the UK, the different nighttime representatives, we all sit in a slightly different place. And what we can do within those places changes depending on which city we are in. So as part of the city office, we've got one city plan in Bristol, which means that doors are kind of open to talk to businesses, operatives within the city, institutions, those sorts of things, to actually come together as a community to try and solve some of the issues of the city. So I would say that the doors have certainly been open for me. Bristol is a city that really does love its nighttime culture, and as soon as there's been somebody to talk to, my inbox hasn't stopped. So I would say, although it's only 6 months old, it feels like I have been here forever already.
Well,
So
I suspect we
it's
might
certainly
need a
been a bit of an
Carly in
open
every
door.
town or city then, actually. And
Yeah, but I
colonial,
think that if I sat outside of the organizational structure of the local government, I think it would be a lot harder to take those needs seriously and to actually have an impactful change on things like planning, licensing, anything, anything to do with like the safety of our patrons, all of those sorts of things. I think it would take me a lot longer to do if I was outside of that structure.
Yes, so I can see that from you can actually make change from the inside. Let me pick up another theme, and maybe Carly will have views on this as well. I mean, quite a lot of the writers have talked about data. And I guess it's all been rather a delight for everyone involved in the GNRP to find out that there's so many people thinking much the same thoughts from all over the world. And it's felt to me as though we're rather in the position of medicine, moving from witchcraft and alchemy to data-driven medicine. We're there now, where we can see that the future is data-driven, it's evidential, it's objective, there are policy tools which we can pull. And Michael, I don't mind saying I reviewed your chapter for the next Journal of Licensing, and it got 5 stars because I thought it was just a fantastic intervention in this field. But this question about start with data, start with measurement, make sure that your interventions are cost effective, that they're efficient, measure their success. I mean, that's a fairly obvious social policy process, but is there anywhere in the world that's actually doing it in relation to the nighttime economy? By the way, I can see Dan's hand up and I'm going to bring him in a second. But Michael, can you deal with that question?
There are a few examples, but frankly, some of this is so new that a proper cycle of, problem identification, program design, community input, program design, measurement, evaluation, and then readjustment, that takes some time to occur. And also, I would say that it's frequently disrupted by political cycles and changes in priority and often doesn't work to completion. I will say that there is a program called the Sept program, which I believe Ricardo recommended to me, which is a drugs and alcohol harm reduction intervention campaign, messaging campaign out from Sweden originally, that has been established in some other cities, that has gone through a number of cycles like that. It's related to the nighttime economy and harm reduction, and by all accounts has been well liked and popular. But one thing that's very difficult to do is have the political buy-in and the capacity on the government side, because for the most part, these kinds of offices are not staffed with a giant team of analysts. And if there is some analysis going on elsewhere within the government, there are frequently people who are responsible for also, creating and analyzing data with like emergency management and transportation and all sorts of other things. So you need a pretty strong data culture in a government to have this happen. But on a private level, we're certainly getting close to a place where we can start evaluating and reevaluating.
Well, that's a fantastic here. I mean, it's something which I've been talking about for sort of 15 years, but didn't necessarily have the scientific tools to do it. And here's Michael sort of bringing those tools to bear. Just before I get to Dan, I promise I'm going to bring you in. Just the natural link then goes to Ali, who actually has done work in the nighttime economy for municipalities here, measuring stuff. So Ali, what's your experience of that, and how can you distinguish the towns that are into it and those that don't want to
know? Yeah, okay, thank you. I suppose going back to Martin's point as a context for it is that, yes, a lot of those big city examples, and Carly's given sort of mid-sized city example. I suppose I was writing down some things in response to that, which is that, what do the people in Cannock want in the evening and night? Does anybody know that there at the moment? I'm not sure they probably do, but maybe I'm wrong about that. What don't they want? And that's another critical thing that we start to learn more about. you know, what do they use at the moment? People often say they want things and then they never use them. So what are they using at the moment? What are they not using? You know, what changes are coming down the line in terms of forecasting societal changes, some of the things that many of us have talked about today in terms of tech, consumer behavior, urban planning. And kind of going back to the work of VibeLab, you know, audit what spaces you've got at the moment. There might not be millions and millions of them in a small town like Cannock, but there is going to be something there in terms of creatives, in terms of space, in terms of outfits and collectives, because Martin mentions more of the independent, you know, kind of stuff. And that is the stuff that's going to make places interesting to go out in the evening. We've just been working with on a plan for a small mid-sized town, and what we found is the landowners in that place, they particularly have a set of people they want to bring in. Okay, so their idea is to map stuff down from above and to bring in what they know is successful in town over here, town over there, town over there, rather than trying to find out what would work really well locally, which is built on local traditions and local talent and so on and so forth. So I think those are things that even small towns can do. You don't have to be the Berlins or the Sydneys or the Bristols even to do those sorts of things. In terms of measurement, I think we use Sydney a lot in our chapter, and I know a lot of people have mentioned it today. I think for me, they've probably done more in a holistic sense of understanding what people want, what is there at the moment. And they've done it at two levels, because there's a state governance, which I think you mentioned or somebody else mentioned. We have state level New South Wales governance there, and then we have you know, municipalities and 33 smallish councils, like London has 32, 33, include the City of London. And so everyone thinks of Sydney, outside of Sydney, as being the centre of Sydney, but of course it's 32 other places. And what they've now done, I think, is after that very difficult period, is bring together state governance, city governance, and to think about the city as a whole, as a place as a whole, and to measure it, to put in place the measurement and that vision that you talked about in the action plan, to actually to get it integrated and working as a whole, rather than simply the centre of Sydney. So there's quite a bit of it in our chapter about that, and I know a few other chapters touch on it, and I would commend that to people who are here, because I feel because of the shock of the lockout laws and the problems they went through, they've really been best placed to try and really start from zero almost about what they really want in that city, rather than trying to retrofit it. So for me, that's the best place so far.
Well, I've written this piece for the journal, and I did tell them that your chapter was the sort of throbbing heart of this whole work. I mean, it's just full of fantastic examples. But the wonderful thing about Sydney is they've seen the past and it doesn't work, and now they've set out the future. So it's just hugely encouraging. If you go to one plan, go to Sydney's nighttime economy strategy. It's absolutely brilliant. But I want to bring in Dan here, because one of the themes which is emerging is that if you show us a good nighttime economy, and we'll show you one that's stuffed full of independence with creativity and entrepreneurship. But how do you make those people want to invest their money? How do you provide an operating environment for them to work in? How do you give them the confidence that they're going to have physically and in regulatory terms, etc., a platform in which they're going to have to make their investments work? Or do you have to be absolutely crazy to sink your well-earned cash into something like this? So I'm going to ask Dan that question, who's not only the esteemed chair of the Institute of Licensing, but is also the chief executive of Rockmount, aka Dan Davis, who is single-handedly regenerating New Brighton on the northwest coast around culture and entertainment. What drives you, Dan, and what frustrates you?
Thanks, Philip. It's at Rock Point.
Did I say Rockmount? Sorry.
Yeah, also Carly, Bristol's a fantastic city, and also very well known for its street art, where it's sort of led the way there with that. I think it's essential that the nighttime is represented, and I think the Nights Art system is a fantastic one. And I know we took steer from the likes of Malik in Amsterdam, and obviously that was copied off Berlin, and it's now gone over to the States. What I'd say though is, when we're talking about whether or not it should be cities that get that sort of representation, or should it, go down to towns and smaller places. Most cities are a collection of villages, hamlets, and towns that end up cities. And they end up, merging together, and some of them end up huge metropolises. If I take the town I'm from, it has 15,000 residents, and it's on a peninsula, and we're about 3 miles away from Liverpool city centre. The only thing that separates us is the River Mersey. Now, I very much looked, when I looked at regenerating New Brighton, and a lot of it was through anger at just seeing a town that I grew up in just get completely written off and destroyed by bad urban planning, by bad licensing and planning decisions where they never spoke to each other, and also really without any of the local residents getting a say in what was happening. So if you look at New Brighton used to have 5 million day trippers alone from Liverpool. And that's because it had a load of things that would make you visit a town like New Brighton, even though there wasn't that many people who lived there. So it had 2 piers, 11 theatres, the largest open air swimming baths in the world, along with another big Lido, the biggest ballroom in Europe. So it sat 4,000 people for a sit-down meal. And on top of that, it's palatial. The Beatles played there 27 times, Little Richard, the Rolling Stones. And on top of it was the largest building in the UK, a tower that was bigger than Blackpool's. Now, over about an 80-year period, these things got destroyed. So I wasn't lucky enough to see the piers, which are at the end of the road I'm sat on now. And what I saw was it systematically get destroyed through bad planning, through no insight. Overlay that with the fact that this particular council are bottom for housing. And the easy solution is to compulsory purchase a load of the businesses that went to the wayside, particularly in the 80s when I grew up. I was born in 73. And in the 80s, places like New Brighton were ravaged with drug abuse, heroin, underinvestment. The piers had gone, so we didn't get the day trippers anymore. And the very thing that would make you visit a town like New Brighton, all the different offers were gone. So I was fortunate enough to be able to go to the largest open air baths in the world, which is now a Morrison's supermarket. Now, you take away every reason to visit a place and people's hopes and dreams and replace it with bog standard mid-tier brands that you can literally go off any dual carriageway and find in an out-of-town retail park. Well, then, don't be surprised that people stop coming there. So a lot of the the last 3.5 years for me, it's been with selling a company I started in New Brighton, CPL, back in 1991, and selling it 3 years ago. And that ended up a global company, training company. It left me the position was, I was trying to make sense of, do I stay on as IOL chairman? And I also sit on the board of UK Hospitality. And I thought I'm in a unique position where I have the money, the time, and certainly the drive and desire to try and make a difference. If you go about 5 miles down the road, there's another town and it has a very similar size population, Lisa. And that has under 50 jobs. There's under 50 jobs in Lisa. And that after 6 o'clock at night, the only places that are open for that 13,500 residents are a fast food outlet and a convenience store. Now, that is why there's a problem. And I think that it is important to have this sort of fight back and representation, because otherwise New Brighton was going exactly the same way. New Brighton would have ended up just some dormitory sort of town where you live, but you don't work. You have you can't go out and socialize, to eat, there's no vibrancy. And these decisions then, to try and reverse them, it can take 30, 40 years. Now, that is pretty much someone's entire working life. So I think that, to bring this to a bit of a conclusion, I think that it is important, not just in cities, to have representation that does give a bit of a fight back and represents what people can do after 6 o'clock at night. And it also gives jobs, opportunity, and a whole sense of community as well, if you do that. So,
brilliant. Well, Dan, I think you're a kind of shining example for for the rest of the UK. I mean, the question has been asked because you were in a sort of although what you've done is amazing, you were in the fortunate position to be able to afford to do it. Imagine that you're a council, you're an authority, it just doesn't have those sort of resources. How do you generate the inspiration for that kind of culture-based regeneration? And I'm just gonna bring Lutz in here and try and tag on.
Sorry, Philip, can I just answer that?
Yeah.
I think it's quite easy.
Go on.
The council I've spent £6.5 million in the last 3.5 years, which has pretty much cleared me out. We haven't had 6.5 pence off the council.
Mm-hmm.
What there will be in lots of places like New Brighton is other people who are in a position, and it could be people who, a lot of them, just half a dozen people, neighbours, things like that, who perhaps can get together and start to sort of regenerate. And I think there are some basic principles that if you show it can be done, people will try and do it. And I think you can work then with councils and hopefully.
Okay. So New Brighton as the pathfinder. Dan, there's a great testament to what you've done there. I'm going to just bring in Lutz here, who's got his hands up.
Yeah, I also wanted to follow up on some of the questions that were dropped here in the chat. One of also was how are nighttime offices being funded? What are the different ways? So I can, but I also want to go into that first question. So I think the experience that we have in Berlin, and I think it's also based on so many years of advocating for our needs, is that now we basically are such a strong organization, and we have so strong relationship with different people in political parties that they start to lobby inside the political system for our needs. So many of the decisions that have been made, for instance, in the Bundestag, that you mentioned before, was a result of a group that was funded, that came together in the Bundestag of different political party representatives lobbying together for the night scene, and I think that is next level advocating for our needs, because you cannot do everything from the outside, especially when it comes to laws and policies and major changes. You need to come with with suggestions from the inside of government, and that really works after a couple of years of trustful relationships. The other question of the governance, how these structures are can be financed, especially when they're outside of government. What we do is we have, and also the model in Amsterdam is based on the same principle, that you have a basic setup of member that pay, because then they also believe in their organization and vote and engage. But then the city or the region or the state gives funding for certain topics they need experts and specialists in. For instance, we as a club commission have several contracts with different departments in the city. For instance, with the economic department, where we're hosting their noise proofing fund. That's a government project, but we are hosting it for them and taking care of it and organizing it. We are working together with the Senate for Culture with a consulting program. We're consulting stakeholders, doing seminars, individual consultations, and we get funding for that as well from the Senate for Culture. We work together with the health department on prevention programs where they give us funding for. So we are basically in a constant collaboration with government structures, but we also an organization that has built up this knowledge, which is almost impossible to do for one person.
Okay. I think the very important point you're making there, Lutz, is that it's very easy to get involved in binary debates with councils. We don't have the money to regenerate the nighttime economies, therefore it's not going to happen. But in fact, what you've got to do is look creatively at what might assist the nighttime economy to grow. It might mean taking a railway arch and allowing a microbrewery to set up in it. It might mean creating cooperative space for some makers or entertainment. There's lots of different ways. It doesn't just involve writing enormous checks to create new towns within towns. I can see Michael wants to come in on this.
Yeah, I wanted to give a perspective from sort of the internal government funding mechanisms for offices such as this. I had mentioned earlier that I was involved in the creation and design of an office, so we had some alternatives that the politicians I was working with were exploring. But one thing that happened here was very much tethered to the opportunity of the moment with available cash resources, tethering it to economic recovery and making arguments that those funds are useful in starting a government office dedicated to the nighttime economy because the sector has been so badly hit and needs support to be established for it. And then the other thing that I would mention is that these things are variously positioned throughout government. For example, my colleague Allison Harnden in Pittsburgh is within public safety, and none of her stakeholders particularly trust public safety necessarily as a place to go for their complaints and stuff like this. So with us, we decided that the small business department in commerce, the commerce department here was an effective place where most of the services and functions that we thought were useful were there, and they had a good culture. And so there's never a one size fits all thing. Depending on wherever you live, you can figure out how, what the most effective people and the most useful government department might be for a position of that nature.
Excellent. Okay. I don't know how long we're thinking of going on, but I want to sort of move to a kind of concluding question, which I want everyone who's still on this panel to have a think about. Maybe I'll finish with Lutz. But I mean, every movement has got its origin story. And I suspect that the origin story of this one might have been Lutz and Mirik meeting and setting up a WhatsApp group, which has mushroomed so quickly into the building of something which looks like a global academic discipline of development of the nightlife sector. So it's an extraordinary moment, and we've all arrived here and we've all got hopes for the future. But what happens next? I want to finish this with Lutz, but if we wanted to carry forward the extraordinary progress that's been made in the last year to 18 months from academics all in their own institutions talking about this stuff locally, to us all now talking about it globally, where does it go from here? Are we going to seize the moment and make it even greater? What do we see the next phase is? I can see Carly grinning away on the right. I'm going to start with you. What's the hopes of the future? And I haven't heard from Lenny and Trudy, and do feel free to come in and offer your perspective on that question.
Should I start off?
Go on then, Lutz.
All right. Okay. So for us, the building on the 7 chapters will be creating a manifesto, because what we also learned throughout communicating this valuable content is that people also not understand yet how big the dimension is. And what we're doing is we developed a workshop format, a virtual workshop format where we invite stakeholders from different countries and continents to join to discuss really why it is so important, and what can their contribution to bring to the table, because I think it needs to be a collaborative approach. It is nothing that we can say is the city has to take care of it. It is something where we have to bring everybody together and work collectively. And I think for many people, this why needs to be answered first. And we are collecting all these voices globally, and then provide these information also then to bring it into a local context and to discuss it locally. And hopefully everybody here can also be a part of that conversation. And after answering the why, we can go into the how and the what. And I think we learned a lot about that today as well.
I think it's been really interesting to see how, after Mirek made such a success of being the night mayor of Amsterdam, so many cities wanted to join that. And I'm really pleased that Jocelyn Kane is in this chat, who was a former leader of the San Francisco Entertainment Commission. And what she points out is it took a referendum vote to entrench that, and it would take a referendum vote to abolish it. So maybe it's a point about institutionalizing this movement through the creation of positions like Carly's, mean that the topic is always on the table. It can never leave the table as long as you've got an energetic person staffing up the body and leading up the movement in local places. What do we think about Lenny and Trudy? Love you to come in on this topic. What do you see as the future now?
Well, I'd love to jump in if that's okay. I'm just kind of flabbergasted in a good way by today's gathering. You know, when we first heard about the night mayors and Ariel was sort of getting involved, and I saw the advertisements for night mayor, and I'm kind of like, gee, I wonder what that is exactly. I knew about Mirek. I'd read all his interviews, and I'm like, I would never want to be that, but I'd love to be on a committee that helps to inform. And why? Because I just felt that this idea of night, it was broader than the clubs, etc. And then I learned about Michael and Creative Footprint. It was just so, influential. And I was, I just kept thinking to myself, how can we ripple outward, from the nightlife category? And I think we've begun to do that, and we're doing it very well. And now today I have a new thought, which is, we are talking about the creative side. We are not focusing so much, Philip, as you were saying, as the complaints, or Michael was saying, who has time to complain? But really to say that we would like to lead night as place, the design of night as place creatively. In my world, it's not just adequate street lighting, for example. So the creatives in music and theater, etc., joining up with a concern and an interest with the rest of us who are working at night, etc. It's just so exciting to think, let's, in this manifesto, let's see how much we can cross-pollinate. I see a really great diagram here. I'll just wrap it up right there and ask the graphic designers to help.
Yeah, I mean, certainly one of the very first messages I took out of this movement was that we need to move from place keeping, which is the job of regulation, to place making, which is the job of creatives. And the successful cities are the ones who are going to do that without harm to other interests. But the prevention of harm is just a technical matter, but the creation of a great city is a matter of creation and imagination. Mark Adam, I can see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Philip, and thanks for all of that presentation. That was really interesting and useful to me, definitely. And I just wanted to make the quick point, which I always make, which is that I represent an organization of 10 different cities in Eastern Europe, hopefully growing to 20 and 30. And so we have a lot of best practice sharing and conversations. And quite often we find that the solutions that are now being talked about in the West are really difficult to implement in the East, and are way beyond what we're doing. I loved the comment about witchcraft as opposed to evidence-based medicine. And we still do a lot of witchcraft. And I'd just like to say that that's going on. So we need to be aware of the witchcraft department of this debate. And actually it can be a big benefit. There's a lot of things that we can try out in Vilnius, or we can slip under the radar, or we can get together 3 cities in Eastern Europe to do something, which maybe would be slower or harder to do in the West. But we know how to make a call to the guy and get things sorted out. So there's, I always like to stick up for Eastern Europe, bring it to people's attention. And if anybody would like to know more specifically about that, then I'm happy to talk to anybody about Eastern Europe all day.
Well, Vilnius is still an absolutely fantastic city for the night. Although, I mean, it's an interesting city because although there's a wonderful creative sector, it has its problems in the way it's been regulated, hasn't it? I mean, there have been quite significant conflicts between the regulators.
There's been conflicts, yeah. I think it's been the way it hasn't been regulated, I would say. It needs to be a little bit regulated. Still too much witchcraft.
I'm going to pass to Dan for just a minute or two, and then I'm going to leave the floor entirely to Lutz to wrap up for us.
Just one other thing, creativity, I think, is at the absolute heart of sort of regeneration and the nightlife. And it isn't just about alcohol and drinking. And that's why in New Brighton, we brought a London style quality art gallery to our little town. We've encouraged street art. A lot of the ideas I got when I traveled both East Coast of America and West Coast of America and all around Europe, looking at examples. I viewed us as like Brooklyn to Manhattan. And that, you know, we just had some water between the two. And what we did was we took spaces and gave a very easy in. So it wasn't, you didn't have to sign a big contract, a lease or anything like that. You could just try something else. So in one venue alone, Rock Point Records, we have 10 businesses operating. We only operate 2 of them. There's a tattoo parlor, a piercer, 3 art studios, a food offer, a gin distillery, and a vinyl record store, as well as a bar. We operate 2 of them. The others pay £50 a week, no big contracts, anything. We've opened up above the shops, and the shops at the bottom half of the road had all been compulsory purchased and knocked down 20 years ago. We knew that the rest of them were going to go the same way. So we had 3 banks on the road with no banks operating, bus stops that no buses stopped at. And we took these sort of spaces and we put art studios in. We put, we want local people and ideas. Independence is the key, you know, in our area, to give people a platform. And it also gives people a reason to visit and not just to go out and drink. So opening retail a bit later, having pop-ups and things like that, you know, some street food, having different sorts of, you know, I remember walking around Brooklyn and going in this old like disused warehouse, and there was about 100 different businesses that just popped up, and you could have a rack of clothes that you made and an Apple Pay and and rock up and set up there. And I think that, you know, in order to create that sort of vibrancy, one of the things that is key is independence, and another one is really push the creative scene. So we've got a lot of musicians. We've taken an old supermarket over, which has been 4 different brands. It was a purpose-built quick save, then it was Summerfield, then it was Co-op, and then it was Budgeons. All failed, and then for 7 years it was just lying there empty. We took it over and we've put this like Brooklyn style market in. We've put a stage in there. We let bands practice free of charge in there, and they help us paint the place. And I think having this sort of, you know, creativity and everything really helps with the fight back.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, Dan, thank you very much. It's about creativity, it's about independence, and I suspect it's also a little bit about ambition. I'm going to draw the panel discussion to a close. If you're interested in the GNLP, then you need to go to www.nighttime.org/recovery plan. If you're interested in the manifesto, then it's /manifesto. The Institute have been wonderful in bringing this collaboration about with the GNLP. So thanks hugely to Dan and to Sue Nelson, who is the Chief Executive of the Institute of Licensing. And thanks also hugely to Lutz, to whom I'm now going to cede the stage so that he can speak the closing inspirational words of this session.
Oh, wow. After we heard so many inspirational words, the only thing I would like to say is what we learned today is we have to look at the night on holistically. So we learned that we need to have a creative community that needs to be supported, especially after this biggest crisis that we probably had in the recent decades. So look into the vulnerability of the creative community, about their needs, and survey them, use data to know more about them. Secondly, you have to have creative space, and creative space needs to be affordable, accessible. It can be on a public space, it can be in a future space, as we discussed it in our chapter number 2. And then you have to have the right framework conditions. And when we talk about framework conditions, we talk about public transportation, we talk about safety at night, we talk about advocacy roles, people that help to translate the needs of the community to governments and back. And of course, we talk about illumination and the aesthetics of the night, and the support of governments that they have and should give to their to that what makes the city enjoyable and livable and unique in many ways. So by closing by saying this, thanks again to the Institute of Licensing to have us here. It's I think the first time we had all the different chapter leads together in one call. So great job. Thanks for your patience also. It was a lot of content, a lot of information. And we are also happy to stay in conversation with you. So have a good evening. Thanks everybody, wherever you are in the world.
Thank you.